Okay, welcome to the Botanical Safety Consortium annual virtual meeting for 2020. I know some people are still connecting, but wanted to go ahead and get started because we have a lot of information to get through today. I appreciate everybody joining virtually from wherever you might be. I'm Michelle Embry, the Associate Director of the Health and Environmental Sciences Institute, or HESI. We're the conveners of the consortium. And I'm just going to go through some very brief introductions and objectives before we launch into the program for today. So the objectives of the meeting are to provide basic information on the structure and the mission and objectives and strategy of the Botanical Safety Consortium, or BSC for short. We're going to share some brief high-level overviews of the current technical working groups, which are our scientific committees that are working to realize the objectives and strategy of the BSC. We're hoping with all of you who are participating today to be able to recruit some additional Botanical Safety Consortium stakeholders, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can become more involved in this project. And then towards the end, we're hoping to solicit some critical input from all of you into the scientific challenges and some of the opportunities that we face related to dietary ingredient safety of botanicals. So I'm just going to briefly walk through the agenda for today. So I'm Michelle Embry doing a brief introduction and objectives. Then we'll switch to Dan Marsman from Procter & Gamble, who will give us an overview of botanical safety, talking about some of the struggles and the needs and hopefully solutions that this consortium will address. Connie Mitchell, who's my colleague at HESI, will talk specifically about the public-private partnership and the organization of the Botanical Safety Consortium. Cynthia Ryder from the National Toxicology Program will give us an overview of the research on botanical safety within that program. Kara Welsh will talk about FDA's dietary supplement program. And then we'll move into the more technical portion of the meeting today, where Joe Dever will talk about the technical working groups within the Botanical Safety Consortium, giving a high-level overview of their mission and objectives and the overall strategy. Stefan Gaffner will talk more specifically about two of our other working groups that are focused on chemical characterization and data analysis. And then Jim Griffiths will talk and give us some conclusions and wrap up with some key questions that we would like you to provide input on. We will have about 45 minutes at the end for discussion and questions from all of you, and hopefully if all of your questions aren't answered on this virtual meeting today, there's plenty of opportunity to email any one of us, and we would be happy to get back to you. So just to cover some logistics for this virtual meeting, the entire meeting will be recorded and made available on our website, as well as PDFs of the slides. All of the participants on this, other than the speakers, are muted, and questions for either the individual speakers or towards the end of the meeting should be typed into the question box. I'll show a slide shot of that in a minute in your control panel for GoToWebinar. We're planning to have around 5 minutes or so after each of the individual presentations for clarifying questions. We ask that you hold the deeper dive, sort of high level questions about the consortium and the specific whether it's endpoints or botanicals or those sorts of things you'd like to talk about towards the end of the webinar in that 12 to 12:45 Eastern time slot, where we'll have much more time for discussion and additional questions. If you have any problems during the webinar, please email me, Michelle Embry. My email address is there, and it's also available on the Botanical Safety Consortium website, botanicalsafetyconsortium.org. So to ask questions, I have two screenshots here. Hopefully this is somewhat similar to what you see right now. We have the desktop view. For those of you who actually have GoToMeeting installed on your computer and you downloaded it, it should look something like this. And you just have to expand that questions tab in the control panel and type your question in, and we will see that. The panelists will see that. For those of you on the web through Instant Join, there is a question mark in the panel, and that's where you'd click on that, and that should pop up a window for you to type in your questions. So with that, I just wanted to put up here really quickly the website. my email, as well as my colleague Connie Mitchell's email, and our general email to the Botanical Safety account. I appreciate everybody joining in. I know more folks are going to join as this goes on, but with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Marsman, who is at Procter & Gamble, and he's going to kind of kick us off with an introduction to why we're working on this topic. So Dan.
Thank you, Michelle. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be with you. Welcome to the inaugural public meeting of the Botanical Safety Consortium. I'm Dan Marsman from P&G Healthcare, and I'm excited by this opportunity to share a little bit on the vision of the consortium, as well as to solicit your participation. In my introductory remarks, I'd like to give a brief overview of the science of botanicals and some of our current safety challenges, and then move into the conceptual development of the BSC. Well, it comes as probably no surprise to this audience that there is broad consumer demand for natural products, and in particular for the dietary or food supplements. Recent data suggests that over half of those dietary supplement users are also taking at least one botanical product. Many of those botanical products are sort of the tried and true botanicals that we are familiar with, but just in this list of the top 12, there are also the impression of increasing popularity of specialized or exotic botanicals. So certainly we are all exposed to botanicals in our everyday life. Dietary fruits and vegetables are as old as time. And so, but it's with the rise of the popularity of botanicals that we appreciate that realistically our ancestors had to learn that these are a highly diverse and creative array of plants. And among them, we recognize that there are really the good, the bad, and the ugly, from everything from dietary mushrooms and our beloved coffee beans to a variety of ingredients that are used to derive botanical drugs, such as taxus and salix and digitalis and poppy, but it also includes those that can have exquisite levels of toxins, such as ricinus or the death cap mushrooms. So certainly safety is a concern for botanicals. First and foremost, I can't help but mention adulteration. It's a particularly troubling area for both the public and the responsible industry. The unacceptable inclusion of intentional economic adulterations is a real problem, but the focus really for the discussion today is the general concerns that also exist with uncertainties about botanicals, and it's important to have that level of transparency about what kinds of constituents and the safety of those botanicals. Certainly, botanicals are complex. You'll hear me say that multiple times in this short presentation. But that complexity comes in multiple dimensions that I hope to illustrate in the next couple of slides. You know, it's recognized that there's over 20,000 plants that are thought to have medicinal benefits. And while many of these have been exploited for human use, very few have actually been fully characterized. When we talk about characterization, that characterization is realistically a challenge, or has been. And so for something as simple as a botanical such as clover, it still can contain hundreds of constituents. So it's a challenge to identify those constituents. But speaking as a toxicologist, it's important to create a realistic safety assessment. So it's not just about identifying each of those constituents, but being able to quantify them for a true risk assessment. When we look at that complexity, though, it's not just on the analytical front, it's honestly in the sourcing of those botanicals, all the way from our agricultural practices. We certainly want to advocate for good agricultural practice, but even with good agricultural practice, we clearly recognize that there are a variety of things that can modify the botanical, including the harvest conditions, so that in that context, when we harvest or where we're harvesting, like in an arid environment or a more fertile environment, can modify the botanical, and certainly how we harvest. The picture in the lower left illustrates an example of that, where the feedstock for one particular botanical clearly has a variety of components included in one botanical ingredient. In addition to agricultural practices, there's complexity that comes in the next stage as those botanicals are processed and put into a product. For a holistic evaluation, that complexity can result through the extraction processes of either expanding the complexity of the botanical or contracting that and concentrating components of that particular botanical. When we put all these things together, it's abundantly clear that there are a variety of ways in which a botanical ingredient can be complex and modified, and the introduction of things like contaminants or adulteration, or just the ordinary modification that occurs in the development of a botanical ingredient for a botanical product. But I would be remiss if I didn't also talk about exposure, because when we talk about botanical safety, the other half of that is a quality safety risk assessment. It only begins with the ingredient itself, but a full risk assessment needs to understand exposure, which can cover the full spectrum of concerns, from the dose to the subpopulation that might be targeted. Dietary supplements, you will notice, are sort of the focus of my opening remarks, but basic safety principles for botanicals apply regardless of the product form, including botanicals that would occur in cosmetics or personal care or specialty foods. All of that would have its application in a better integrity of the raw materials and understanding that exposure scenario. Well, how do we think about testing botanicals when we have a botanical and there is concerns? Traditionally, the testing schemes were built around single chemicals, and as you can see in this slide, toxicity testing and safety evaluation is a process that typically was catered towards single chemicals. We're thinking here about drugs or commodity chemicals or pesticides. In the case of drugs, we think of that in terms of a regulatory structure that is focused on ensuring safety and efficacy. And we assume that there may be harm until we can prove these ingredients to be safe. That they are typically isolated constituents and chemicals, and so they are simple and consistent, and the biological activity is focused on that simple chemistry. Botanicals are almost the polar opposite of that, right? They are a regulatory structure that, at least in the US, is aimed at ensuring access, and they're assumed to be safe until proven harmful. And they are complex, as I've said numerous times already, and that biological activity is provided to the whole mixture, not necessarily to any one constituent. The important part of the botanical side of the equation is that assumption of safety. It is a hallmark of the botanicals because they are a natural part of our food chain. This is clearly something that we recognize, and we're thankful for the many efforts that others have gone to great extremes to establish already a solid foundation for safety for botanicals. I have here just a couple of publications to make that point, but it's clear that much work has already been done, especially on the international front, to progress the definitions of what a safe history of use is, and good agricultural practice, and good manufacturing practice. All of these things are critical, but particularly the safe history of use is an important part of establishing the safety of a botanical. And we're talking here about historical records that can establish the dose and the duration, the type of population in which this particular botanical has been used in the past, and what exactly is that botanical and how was it prepared and extracted and administered. So the question quickly becomes, as we see the enhanced interest in botanicals, is what if indeed the botanical is not identical to that history of use? Your botanical is of a different extract or even a different species, but very similar. Where do we go from there? Well, traditionally, that would be toxicology. For resolving these uncertainties, we would use traditional non-clinical testing. Unfortunately, traditional toxicology tools are generally not fit for purpose for botanicals. For a novel botanical, the current safety qualification process is highly dependent upon animal testing, but there's often a high degree of variability when we're evaluating mixtures. And what we recognize is that it's often an insensitive tool for discerning minor variations, like I was just describing, between raw materials. When you have all of those minor variations and they continue to occur over time, it really becomes problematic as a resource and a time-intensive process, and that notwithstanding the moral and ethical considerations of animal use. The good news is, fortunately, we have new methodologies that continue to be developed, including advances in chemical analysis, which provides a much clearer picture of the composition of the raw material and the variance between those raw materials. And comparative chromatography will give us both qualitative and quantitative assessment of the differences between raw materials. This is such a critical advance in the science of analytical chemistry, and therefore sets us up for the ability to apply that knowledge into a framework that indeed there has also been such progress on the toxicology side with current safety methods that involve both in vitro and in ex vivo and in silico tools. We have a variety of opportunities that provide real promise for the evaluation of the toxicologies of mixtures. These advances in characterization and safety testing are the fuel that actually brought together a diverse array of scientists, and that becomes the focus of the rest of the morning. Through a series of international meetings, first in Europe at Eurotox, and again in the US at the International Congress on the Science of Botanicals. There was an array of discussions talking about the opportunities to apply chemical characterization and new tools of toxicology to address the safety concerns associated with botanical mixtures. And this became an important conversation, and clearly it has grown to be diverse array from both the public and the private sector in a broad conversation that continues even now. So with that, let me just summarize and say there's growing demand for botanical products and a growing trend towards modified or specialty botanicals. That diverse botanical starting material coupled with variable agriculture and processing practices has created challenges that we all face on both the public and private side. And therefore there's an ongoing need to bridge to various materials and have a transparent discussion about how one might qualify new botanical materials. And the good news is that there is truly opportunities in front of us to apply 21st century methods to address these concerns. Out of this common understanding, the concept of the Botanical Safety Public-Private Cooperative was born. What you're about to hear is the BSC's proposed path forward, driven by our work and our working mission statement, which is to enhance the botanical safety toolkit and bring clarity to botanical dietary ingredient assessments for both manufacturers and regulators. And with that, I'll turn it back to Michelle.
Great, thank you, Dan. So we do have some time for clarification questions for Dan. I just ask you, as I talked about in the beginning, to utilize the questions box and type your questions in. So I will give it a couple minutes for people to type. Connie, I'll give you the slides. For those of you who have asked some questions already and maybe who missed the beginning, the slides will be made available on the Botanical Safety Consortium website as well as the recording. And we'll send an email to everybody who's registered for this, letting them know when those are posted and available. Okay, there is one question for Dan from Jessica Collins. The concern will be regarding patenting supplements. Will this be potential in the future? I don't know if anyone on the group has insight into that. It's not something we've discussed.
I don't think it's anything we've discussed. We certainly, if the question is in reference to the patenting of methods in particular, that would not be the approach of the BSC, because we really want the approach and the toolkit to be available for everyone who is operating in this arena. So ideally, while there may be proprietary methods out there, there would be a common platform in which the botanical safety would be accessible for everyone.
Yeah, and that's something that I think you'll see in the next talk, that this is a public-private partnership and is something that we really do plan to make everything that we work on publicly and openly available. So there's a comment from Bhaskar Mukherjee. Any comments about the history of use in assessing safety of botanicals?
Certainly, I hinted at it in my talk. The history of safe use is a critical component to botanical safety. That history of use, of course, requires a detailed knowledge of the exact exposures that one encounters. So that is where it's important to understand that there's been a good historical record for the type of preparation that's been used for an extended period of time in a focused population or a diverse population. It is a critical part of the safety assessment. When we think about a decision matrix of evaluating a new raw material, it is the starting gate for any evaluation of botanical. Is what do we already know in terms of the history of safe use of that ingredient or ingredients like it. And so when we get into the analytical characterization and the testing, it's always going to be hopefully against a backdrop of an established history of safe use of that material or materials closely like it.
Thanks, Dan. I'm trying to type answers as they come through. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I'm just slowly catching up. Question from Daryl Sullivan. Would a deliverable of the BSc be a way to think about how to conduct safety testing based on the data that this effort delivers?
The goal is to provide a scientific toolkit to provide the opportunity for the characterization of the safety of a botanical. We, as a public-private partnership, we are not expecting that the deliverables will be how that data will be used. That is a separate exercise within a regulatory framework, but our goal would be to create a toolkit that would enable that conversation to occur.
Thank you, Dan. Okay. So one other question related to the recorded webinar, it will be available and the slides will be available on the website, so you could use it. Someone asked if they could use this material as an online college course. We would love for the Botanical Safety Consortium materials to be used more broadly. So, and I will also provide a transcript of the questions and answers, assuming, yes, I will provide a transcript because it will be recorded. I can add those on. Okay, just going through questions here quickly, sorry. Keep up with them all. So there was a point related to, please let the audience know that USP is establishing some public standards for botanicals that are used in dietary supplements, and these would provide safety to consumers. And that's just information from Dr. Srivasan. Kathleen Lee had a question, more specifically, are there labeling rules for different age cohorts for botanicals? Does anyone have any insight there? Anyone want to take that one? I don't know the answer to that. We can follow up on that one. Okay. So one other question, and I think some of this might come up later on as well. Is there sort of a quote unquote Bible of safe daily use levels of these common botanicals in the public domain, a go-to document? I don't think there is, but I don't know if anyone on the group would like to comment on that.
That is often a common struggle that we have when we're looking at botanicals, and it might be an opportunity for some of our international colleagues to jump in here, because I think some of them have had the most recent focused effort on establishing definitions for safe history of use and the evidence for that.
Mm-hmm. That is something. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, this is Stefan. I tend to point people sometimes to the Botanical Safety Handbook. You won't find all the information there, but I think it's a good start to look at least history of safe use and published data on a big number of important botanicals.
Okay. There is a question from George Parasakov. This is the George. I'm just going to leave it at that. We will talk about the BSC's history in the next talk, so I'm going to hold on that one. And then I think per the question related to age-specific guidelines, you know, I think there was a follow-up question about elderly adults and guidance on dosing. And I think that's something that has come up many times. It doesn't sound like there's anyone on this call who has any insight on specific labeling for age groups.
I think that will be something that we'll address at least superficially in some of the talks following me, but that is clearly going to become a greater interest for some of the technical working groups as we get into systemic toxicology of some of the endpoints and things like that. There are clearly endpoints for which the elderly would be have some increased vulnerability for. So there may indeed be the opportunity to look at whether the assays have the sensitivity for that concern.
Okay. So I will also note in the questions there are various resources per that other question that people have mentioned. One group mentioned Health Canada and Natural Medicine's database for information. There are some texts available from traditional medicine field. The Botanical Safety Handbook by AHPA is one resource as well. So those are some other ones. And one of the things we're trying to do with the consortium is provide a resource page on our website. It's not up yet, but if you guys, if you have specific suggestions of resources that you're aware of that we could include in that, that would be extremely useful because we do get this question quite a bit. So I had just a couple other questions. This is great. And we might be able to circle back to some of these later. Bernadette Sheridan asks, I see several products with botanicals now being marketed as food. Would we assume the use of a botanical is safe providing in food, I assume, is safe providing it does not exceed the dose listed in the monograph? And I just will jump in to say that within this consortium, we're looking at botanical ingredients. And so the use, and we're focusing on oral exposure. So the use of botanicals in food is in scope of the consortium. And I think the evaluating the dose levels and the different preparations is something that we'll be discussing. Okay. I'm just scrolling through just a couple more. Thanks for your patience here. So Jim McGregor just had a point related to the discussion on the history of safe use, that's emphasized, but there are limitations for delayed toxicities, those dependent on individual sensitivity and secondary factors. So those are things to consider. And I think a lot of what we're trying to do here with the consortium is to help identify additional assays that could help us further elucidate safety. Does anyone else have any other comments on that?
No, other than Jim makes a good point, which is one of the limitations of the data mining for history of safe use is oftentimes one of the hallmarks is the history, the longevity of that use in a diverse enough population to be able to address those kinds of concerns that he's raised.
Okay, great. And then there's a couple more great resources, so appreciate that. Jürgen Schnabel mentions, just as an FYI, that the FEMA expert panel is in the process of reevaluating all of the FEMA GRAS botanicals. So that's another related effort that's happening. Question was, do we consider the ethnomedicine driven processes as well? I think that the potential use of ethnomedicines, botanicals is, and if those botanicals would be in the scope and considered by the consortium, I think we're really looking at botanicals more holistically related to oral use. So depending on the particular types of botanicals and the endpoints that we're looking at, I don't see a reason that would not be potentially in scope.
Mhm.
right? Okay, I'm just going to we're right at time here. Just one more quick question. Any updates regarding facilitating clinical trial assessments of botanicals?
I guess it brings up just a general point of what won't be covered probably today, and that is the BSC has need to have a targeted focus for our efforts, and that focus is on sort of the qualifying with a toolkit of botanicals. However, there are certainly things you've mentioned. You know, this is mostly about oral, but it doesn't mean that the BSC will not have the potential for direct impact upon things like cosmetic products and stuff. And in this case, clinical trials. It's sort of out of scope for the BSC, but we would love for a dialogue to continue in that realm, and whatever we can do to facilitate that would be a satellite kind of effort would be terrific.
Okay. And then one more point from Bodie Timms related to the comment is on with the speed and ease of use, will genetic testing be used with every botanical trial or assay to generate some pharmacogenetic data that might provide a context for some toxicity information? We don't have the plans to do that, but I think discussions related to the value of some of those assays and methods to do that are something we could explore, but it's not currently in scope, I don't think, for any of the working groups. Does anyone have any insight on that?
Certainly
Okay.
something that the Gene Tox Working Group can look at.
Yes, for sure. Okay, so I still have all the questions up. There might be some more that have come in, but I think that we will move on and we can circle back to some of those questions later. So please do not fear if we didn't get to your question. There's a lot coming in.